Some moments in life hit you like lightning when you least expect them. They strip away all the walls we build around our hearts and remind us that beneath every uniform, every title, and every carefully maintained composure, we are all just human beings capable of extraordinary emotion. What happened on that quiet Tuesday morning at Arlington National Cemetery would become one of those moments that changes everything. A moment where duty met grief, where protocol collided with pure human connection, and where a single woman's act of love would bring a seasoned royal guard to his knees in front of thousands of onlookers. This is not just a story about military tradition or ceremonial duties. This is about the moment when the human heart refuses to be contained by rules and regulations. It's about how sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply allow ourselves to feel, even when the whole world is watching. The woman didn't know she was about to create one of the most emotionally charged scenes ever witnessed at a military cemetery. The guard had no idea his life was about to change forever. But sometimes the universe conspires to create moments of such raw, authentic emotion that they remind us all of what truly matters in this world. What you're about to read is the true story of that day, told through the eyes of those who witnessed it, those who lived it, and those whose lives were forever changed by a single moment of genuine human connection that broke through decades of military protocol and touched millions of hearts around the world. Margaret Thompson had been planning this trip for over 2 years. At 68 years old, she had saved every penny from her part-time job at the local grocery store in small-town Ohio to make the journey to Washington, D.C. Her destination wasn't the monuments or museums that drew millions of tourists each year. She was going to Arlington National Cemetery to visit the grave of her son, Private First Class Michael Thompson, who had been killed in action in Afghanistan 7 years earlier. The morning air was crisp as Margaret stepped off the metro train, her weathered hands clutching a small bouquet of yellow roses, Michael's favorite flowers. She had grown them in her backyard garden specifically for this moment. Her heart hammered against her ribcage as she walked through the gates of the cemetery, each step bringing her closer to her son. Meanwhile, at the tomb of the unknown soldier, Sergeant James Mitchell was preparing for what seemed like another routine day of ceremonial duty. At 28 years old, James had served as a royal guard for 3 years, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had also protected this sacred ground. The precision, the discipline, the unwavering dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. It was more than a job to James. It was a calling that ran through his bloodline. James had performed the changing of the guard ceremony over 1,000 times. Every movement was calculated, every step measured to perfection. The 21 steps he took across the black mat in front of the tomb represented the 21-gun salute, the highest honor given to any military or foreign dignitary. He would pause for exactly 21 seconds, turn, and repeat the process. Rain or shine, heat or cold, day or night, the tomb was never left unguarded. As James took his position that Tuesday morning, hundreds of visitors gathered to witness the solemn ceremony. Among them was Margaret, who had decided to watch the changing of the guard before visiting Michael's grave. She stood toward the back of the crowd, her yellow roses pressed against her chest, tears already forming in her eyes as she watched the young soldier's precise movements. The ceremony began like clockwork. The relief commander approached the tomb with deliberate steps, his polished shoes clicking against the stone with military precision. James stood motionless, his rifle at his shoulder, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The crowd fell silent, understanding the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. But something was different about this day. As James performed his duties, he caught a glimpse of Margaret in his peripheral vision. Something about the way she stood, the way she held those flowers, the way tears streamed down her weathered cheeks, struck him with unexpected force. In that moment, despite years of training to remain emotionally detached, James felt a connection that transcended military protocol. Margaret watched the young guard with growing emotion. The way he moved reminded her of Michael during his training at basic training. The pride in his posture, the dedication in every step, the unwavering commitment to duty. It was exactly how her son had carried himself. She remembered the last time she had seen Michael in uniform, standing tall and proud at the airport before his final deployment. The changing of the guard continued, but James found himself struggling to maintain his usual emotional distance. Every time he turned and walked past Margaret's section of the crowd, he could see her grief, her love, her pride all mixed together in her expression. He had witnessed thousands of visitors over the years, many of them emotional, many of them there to honor lost loved ones. But Something about Margaret's presence was affecting him in a way he had never experienced before. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward from the crowd, her yellow roses in hand, and approached the rope barrier that separated visitors from the tomb area. The security guards immediately noticed her movement, but something about her demeanor made them pause rather than react. Margaret looked directly at James as he completed another pass. Through her tears, she whispered words that only he could hear. "Thank you for honoring my son. He would be so proud to know soldiers like you are protecting this sacred place." James heard every word despite the distance and the whispered delivery. Something inside him cracked. For the first time in his 3 years of service at the tomb, he felt his composure slipping. The walls he had built to maintain professional distance crumbled in an instant. Margaret continued, her voice breaking with emotion. His name was Michael Thompson. He was 22 when he died for this country. Every step you take honors his memory and the memory of all our children who never came home. The crowd began to notice that something unusual was happening. James had stopped his measured march and was standing perfectly still, his rifle at his side, his eyes locked on Margaret's face. Visitors started pulling out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. James had been trained to handle disruptions, to maintain order, to continue the ceremony regardless of outside interference. But this wasn't interference. This was a moment of pure human connection that transcended every rule and regulation he had ever learned. Margaret wasn't disrupting the ceremony. She was becoming part of its deeper meaning. The relief commander, noticing the break in protocol, took a step toward James to intervene. But he too was struck by the intensity of the moment. Margaret's words carried across the silent crowd, and everyone present could feel the weight of her grief and the power of her gratitude. James found himself walking toward Margaret, each step deliberate, but no longer following the prescribed pattern. His training told him to maintain his position, to continue the ceremony, to preserve the dignity of the tomb. But his heart told him something different. His heart told him that sometimes honoring the fallen meant acknowledging the living who carried their memory. As James approached the barrier where Margaret stood, the entire cemetery seemed to hold its breath. This was unprecedented. Royal Guards simply did not break protocol. They did not engage with visitors during ceremonies. They did not allow personal emotions to interfere with their sacred duties. But James was no longer thinking about protocol. He was thinking about his grandfather, who had served in World War II and had taught him about the true meaning of military service. He was thinking about all the mothers like Margaret who had lost children in service to their country. He was thinking about the young soldiers who would never have the chance to grow old, to see their mothers again, to feel the warmth of a loving embrace. Margaret extended the yellow roses toward James, her hands trembling with emotion. "These are for him," she whispered. "These are for Michael and for all of them." The crowd watched in stunned silence as James reached across the barrier and gently took the roses from Margaret's hands. The moment their fingers touched, something profound passed between them. It was more than just the transfer of flowers. It was the transfer of grief, of gratitude, of understanding, of shared humanity. James looked down at the yellow roses in his hands, then back up at Margaret's face. The tears that had been threatening to fall throughout the entire exchange finally broke free. For the first time in 3 years of service at the tomb, Sergeant James Mitchell allowed himself to cry while on duty. The crowd gasped as they watched the stoic Royal Guard, who had maintained perfect composure through countless ceremonies, break down in tears while holding a mother's roses. Some visitors began crying themselves, moved by the raw emotion of the moment. Others stood in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred and unrepeatable. Margaret reached across the barrier and placed her weathered hand on James's arm. "It's okay," she whispered. "They would want us to feel this. They would want us to remember them with all our hearts." James nodded, unable to speak. He had spent years honoring unknown soldiers, maintaining vigil over those whose names had been lost to history. But, in this moment, he was honoring a specific soldier, Private First Class Michael Thompson, and connecting with the mother who had loved him and lost him. The relief commander made the decision to allow the moment to continue. He understood that sometimes the most perfect ceremony is the one that breaks from perfection to embrace genuine human emotion. The changing of the guard could wait. This moment was bigger than protocol. James carefully placed the yellow roses at the base of the tomb, each movement deliberate and respectful. As he stood back up, he looked at Margaret one more time. Without words, They had shared something that would stay with both of them forever. The crowd burst into spontaneous applause, not for the ceremony, but for the human moment they had just witnessed. People were openly crying, hugging strangers, and talking quietly about their own connections to military service and sacrifice. Margaret stepped back from the barrier, her heart feeling both empty and full at the same time. She had given her roses to her son through this young soldier, and, in return, she had received something she hadn't expected, the knowledge that Michael's sacrifice was truly honored by those who continued to serve. James resumed his position, but everything had changed. His steps still measured 21 paces, his turns were still precise, but now each movement carried the weight of Margaret's story, and the knowledge that behind every ceremonial duty was a real person, a real family, and real grief that deserved to be acknowledged. The video of Margaret Thompson and Sergeant James Mitchell's emotional encounter spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours, millions of people around the world had watched the moment when a royal guard broke protocol to accept yellow roses from a grieving mother. The hashtag yellow roses for Michael began trending as people shared their own stories of military sacrifice and loss. Margaret had no idea about the viral sensation she had created. After leaving the tomb of the unknown soldier, she had walked to Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery to find her son's grave. Her heart felt different, lighter somehow, knowing that Michael's memory had been honored in such a special way. She knelt beside the white marble headstone that bore her son's name and rank, finally, allowing herself to fully grieve. Back at the tomb, James continued his duties for the remainder of his shift, but his fellow guards could see that something fundamental had changed in him. During the brief moments between ceremonies, they approached him with questions and concerns. Had he thought about the potential consequences of breaking protocol? Was he prepared to face disciplinary action? Did he regret what he had done? James looked at each of his fellow guards with a calmness that surprised even himself. "I would do it again in a heartbeat," he said quietly. "That woman's son died protecting the freedoms we're sworn to defend. If honoring his memory and acknowledging his mother's grief means facing consequences, then so be it. Some things are more important than protocol." Word of the incident reached Colonel Patricia Williams, the commanding officer overseeing ceremonial duties at Arlington National Cemetery, within an hour of it happening. Several phone calls had come in from visitors who wanted to both praise and question what they had witnessed. The colonel found herself in an unprecedented situation. Never before had a royal guard broken such established protocol during a ceremony. Colonel Williams had served in the military for over 25 years and had overseen the tomb of the unknown soldier for the past 5 years. She understood the importance of maintaining dignity and order at the ceremony. But she also understood the deeper meaning of what the guards were protecting, the memory of those who had given everything for their country. As she reviewed the video footage from the cemetery's security cameras, Colonel Williams found herself moved by what she saw. The interaction between Margaret and James wasn't disruptive or disrespectful. It was, in many ways, the purest expression of why the tomb existed in the first place. The unknown soldiers represented all the fallen, and Margaret's son Michael was part of that legacy. Meanwhile, news crews began arriving at Arlington National Cemetery as the story gained national attention. Margaret, completely unaware of the media frenzy, was discovered by a reporter while she sat beside Michael's grave, talking to him about the morning's events. "I told him about the young soldier who took my roses," Margaret explained to the reporter, tears streaming down her face. "I told him that people still remember, that people still care about the sacrifices that were made. Michael always worried that he would be forgotten. Now I know he never will be." The reporter, Sarah Chun from a national news network, was struck by Margaret's genuine emotion and the simplicity of her story. This wasn't about politics or military policy. This was about a mother's love and a country's gratitude expressed in the most basic human way possible. Back at the tomb, James was informed that he needed to report to Colonel Williams' office immediately after his shift ended. His fellow guards offered support and encouragement, but James knew he was likely facing serious disciplinary action. Breaking protocol at the tomb of the unknown soldier was not taken lightly, regardless of the emotional circumstances. As James walked to the colonel's office, he reflected on his 3 years of service at the tomb. He thought about his grandfather, who had taught him that military service was about more than following orders. It was about understanding why those orders existed and knowing when humanity should take precedence over regulation. Colonel Williams was waiting for him with a grave expression. "Sergeant Mitchell," she began, I'm sure you understand why you're here. What happened this morning was a clear breach of established protocol. The ceremony at the tomb of the unknown soldier has specific procedures that exist for very important reasons. James stood at attention. Yes, ma'am. I understand completely. However, the colonel continued, her expression softening slightly. I've spent the afternoon reviewing the incident from multiple angles. I've watched the security footage, read the witness statements, and spoken with several visitors who were present during the ceremony. James remained silent, waiting for whatever consequences were coming. What I saw, Colonel Williams said, was a soldier who understood the deepest meaning of his duty. The tomb exists to honor the unknown soldiers, but also to represent all who have fallen in service to this country. That woman's son is part of that legacy, and your recognition of her grief honored not just him, but every family member who has lost someone in military service. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he remained cautious. Military discipline was serious business, and good intentions didn't always excuse broken rules. Colonel Williams stood up from her desk and walked to the window that overlooked the cemetery. I've been contacted by news organizations from around the world who want to interview you about what happened. I've also received calls from military families thanking us for showing compassion to one of our own. And I've gotten feedback from visitors who said that witnessing your interaction gave them a deeper understanding of what military service and sacrifice really mean. She turned back to face James. The question is, how do we move forward from here? The tomb ceremony requires discipline and consistency, but it also requires guards who understand that they're protecting something much larger than themselves. James took a deep breath before responding. Ma'am, I believe that what I did was consistent with the true purpose of our mission. The unknown soldiers represent all the fallen, including Private First Class Michael Thompson. His mother deserved recognition for her sacrifice as much as her son deserved recognition for his. If I'm disciplined for that decision, I accept it without complaint. Colonel Williams nodded approvingly. Your willingness to accept consequences shows integrity, Sergeant. But, after careful consideration, I've decided that no disciplinary action will be taken. What you did was unorthodox, but it was also exactly what those unknown soldiers would have wanted, recognition for the families who loved them and lost them. James felt overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Colonel Williams replied. But there's more we need to discuss. The media attention from this incident has been extraordinary. We've received requests for interviews from major news networks, and the video has been viewed millions of times. We need to handle this carefully and professionally. Over the next several hours, both James and Margaret found themselves thrust into a spotlight neither of them had sought. The story resonated with people because it represented something authentic in a world that often felt artificial and divided. Here was a simple moment of human connection that transcended politics, geography, and background. Margaret was approached by multiple news organizations wanting to tell her story and Michael's story. Initially hesitant about the attention, she eventually agreed to a few interviews because she realized it was an opportunity to honor her son's memory and the memory of all fallen soldiers. James also agreed to limited media appearances, always emphasizing that his actions were simply a reflection of what any soldier would do when faced with a mother's grief. He deflected praise toward the families who had lost loved ones and the soldiers who continued to serve. The yellow roses that Margaret had given to James were carefully preserved and placed in a special display case near the tomb, along with a plaque that read, "In memory of Private First Class Michael Thompson and all who have made the ultimate sacrifice," given by his mother, Margaret Thompson, and accepted with honor by the guards who continue their eternal vigil. As the day ended, both Margaret and James had been forever changed by their brief encounter. Margaret returned to her hotel room feeling that she had found closure she didn't know she was seeking. James returned to his quarters knowing that his understanding of his duty had deepened in ways he never expected. But the story was far from over. The world had taken notice of their moment of shared humanity, and the ripple effects would continue to spread in ways neither of them could have imagined. What started as a simple act of remembrance had become a symbol of hope, compassion, and the enduring power of human connection in the face of loss and grief. 3 days after the Yellow Roses incident, Margaret Thompson sat in her small hotel room in Arlington, Virginia, overwhelmed by the hundreds of messages that had poured in from around the world. Her simple flip phone had been replaced with a smartphone by her daughter, who flew in from California to help her navigate the sudden attention. The messages came from military families, veterans, active duty soldiers, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by her story. Mrs. Thompson, your courage to honor your son publicly has given me strength to visit my brother's grave for the first time since his funeral 5 years ago, read one message from a woman in Texas. Another came from a veteran in Germany. Thank you for reminding us all why we serve. Your son's sacrifice will never be forgotten. Meanwhile, James Mitchell discovered that his life had changed dramatically as well. When he reported for duty at the tomb that morning, he found dozens of bouquets of yellow roses left by visitors who had heard Margaret's story. Each bouquet came with notes thanking him for his compassion and sharing stories of loved ones lost in military service. Colonel Williams called an emergency meeting with her staff to address the unprecedented situation. We've received over 10,000 requests for tomb ceremonies to be dedicated to specific fallen soldiers, she explained to the assembled officers. Families from across the country want to bring flowers and have moments like the one Mrs. Thompson shared with Sergeant Mitchell. The dilemma was complex. The tomb of the unknown soldier was specifically designed to honor unidentified soldiers who represented all the fallen. Opening it up to individual memorial services could fundamentally change its meaning and purpose. Yet the public response to Margaret's story showed a deep hunger for this kind of meaningful connection between the living and the dead. James raised his hand during the meeting. Ma'am, if I may suggest something. What if we created a specific time each week where families like Mrs. Thompson could approach the tomb with flowers? Not to change the ceremony, but to add to it in a meaningful way. Colonel Williams considered the suggestion carefully. That's actually not a bad idea, Sergeant. We could establish a family recognition hour where pre-screened military families could participate in a special ceremony designed to honor their specific loved ones while maintaining the integrity of the tomb's original purpose. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a military historian who had been following the story closely, reached out to both Margaret and James to propose documenting their experience for future generations. What happened between you two represents something important about American military culture, she explained during a conference call. It shows how individual stories of sacrifice connect to the larger narrative of service and duty. Margaret initially hesitated about participating in any kind of formal documentation. I'm not special, she insisted. I'm just a mother who missed her son and wanted to honor his memory. There are thousands of mothers like me. That's exactly why your story matters so much, Dr. Harper replied. You represent all those mothers, and your interaction with Sergeant Mitchell shows how we as a society can do better at acknowledging military families. James agreed to participate in the documentation project because he saw it as an opportunity to highlight the deeper meaning of ceremonial military duty. People see the guards at the tomb and think it's just pageantry, he explained. But every step we take, every movement we make, is a prayer for the fallen. Mrs. Thompson helped me understand that our duty isn't just to the unknown soldiers. It's to all the families who need to know their loved ones are remembered. As word of the proposed Family Recognition Hour spread, military support organizations across the country began organizing trips for families to participate. The Gold Star Mothers, an organization of mothers who had lost children in military service, announced plans to bring dozens of members to Arlington for the first official ceremony. Margaret decided to stay in the D.C. area for another week to participate in planning the new program. Working with Colonel Williams and cemetery officials, she helped design a process that would be meaningful for families while respectful of the tomb's sacred nature. We need to make sure this isn't about politics or publicity, Margaret insisted during one planning meeting. This is about love, the love between parents and children, the love between spouses, the love for country that motivated our sons and daughters to serve. The first official Family Recognition Hour was scheduled for the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Margaret's spontaneous encounter with James. News media from around the world requested permission to cover the ceremony, but Margaret and James agreed that only a limited pool of reporters would be allowed, with the focus remaining on the families rather than the media spectacle. During the week leading up to the ceremony, James received a visit from his grandfather, retired Staff Sergeant William Mitchell, who had served at various military installations throughout his career. The elderly man had seen the viral video and driven from his home in Pennsylvania to speak with his grandson. I've been thinking about what you did, the grandfather said as they walked through Arlington National Cemetery together. Your grandmother wanted me to tell you that she's proud of you. She lost her brother in Korea, and she said what you did for that mother is what she would have wanted someone to do for her own mother. James felt the weight of family history as they stopped at various graves throughout the cemetery. Each headstone represented a person with a story, a family that had grieved, a future that had been cut short by war and conflict. The thing about military service, his grandfather continued, is that it connects generations. The values we fight for don't change, even if the wars do. Honor, duty, compassion, these things are eternal. What you showed that mother is that we still remember why we serve. Meanwhile, Margaret spent her extra time in Washington visiting other military sites and connecting with families who had similar stories of loss. She visited Walter Reed Medical Center to meet with wounded veterans and their families, and she spoke at a support group for military spouses who had lost their partners in combat. At each stop, Margaret shared not just her own story, but James's story as well. That young man reminded me that there are still people in uniform who understand what service really means, she would tell audiences. He showed me that my son's sacrifice matters not just to me, but to the soldiers who continue to serve today. The planning for the Family Recognition Hour became more complex as word spread. Families from across the country requested permission to participate, sharing their own stories of loss and their desire to honor their fallen loved ones. Each application was carefully reviewed to ensure that the ceremony would remain dignified and meaningful rather than chaotic or commercialized. James worked closely with the other tomb guards to prepare for the modified ceremony. They practiced incorporating family participation into their traditional routine while maintaining the precision and solemnity that the tomb required. It was a delicate balance between innovation and tradition. "We're not changing what we do," James explained to his fellow guards during one training session. "We're just opening our hearts a little wider to include the families who need to be part of this." Dr. Harper continued her documentation work by interviewing other military families about their experiences with grief, remembrance, and the need for public recognition of their losses. What she discovered was that Margaret's experience was far from unique. Thousands of families struggled with feeling that their loved ones' sacrifices had been forgotten by a society that often moved on quickly from military conflicts. The Yellow Roses incident tapped into something that was already there, Dr. Harper explained in her preliminary report. Military families have always needed ways to connect with the larger meaning of their losses. Mrs. Thompson and Sergeant Mitchell created a bridge between individual grief and collective remembrance. As the week progressed, James found himself changed by the constant reminders of why his duty mattered. Every day brought new flowers, new letters, new stories from families who had been touched by his interaction with Margaret. He began to see his role at the tomb not just as ceremonial duty, but as active ministry to those who grieved. Margaret, meanwhile, discovered a new sense of purpose in her extended time in Washington. She began volunteering with military family support organizations and found that her experience had given her unique credibility with other grieving parents. "I understand now that Michael's death wasn't the end of his story," she reflected during an interview with Dr. Harper. "It was the beginning of a new chapter where his sacrifice continues to inspire others to remember and honor all our fallen heroes." The night before the first official Family Recognition Hour, both Margaret and James found themselves unable to sleep. They were about to participate in something that had never been done before, a formal ceremony that honored both unknown soldiers and specifically remembered fallen heroes, all while maintaining the sacred dignity that the tomb demanded. Neither of them knew exactly what would happen the next morning, but both of them understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, a movement toward greater recognition of military sacrifice and more meaningful support for military families. The Yellow Roses had started something that would continue long after they returned to their regular lives. The morning of the first official Family Recognition Hour dawned clear and bright at Arlington National Cemetery. By 7 a.m., 43 military families from across the United States had gathered near the tomb of the unknown soldier, each carrying flowers and photographs of their fallen loved ones. Margaret Thompson stood among them, no longer alone in her grief, but surrounded by others who understood her journey intimately. James Mitchell arrived at the tomb 2 hours before the ceremony to ensure every detail was perfect. This wasn't just another changing of the guard. It was the beginning of a new tradition that could honor thousands of families while maintaining the sacred dignity of the tomb. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders as he inspected his uniform and reviewed the modified ceremony procedures one final time. Colonel Williams had worked tirelessly with military chaplains, cemetery officials, and family service organizations to create a ceremony that would be meaningful without being overwhelming. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Families would be invited to approach the tomb in small groups, place their flowers at the base, and share their loved one's name and story with the guard on duty. The guard would then acknowledge each fallen soldier by name before resuming the traditional ceremony. Among the families present was Robert and Linda Chun, whose son Captain David Chun had been killed by an improvised explosive device in Iraq 6 years earlier. They had driven from Oregon specifically to participate in this ceremony. "We visited David's grave here many times," Linda explained to a nearby reporter. "But this feels different. This feels like the whole country is acknowledging what he gave up for all of us." Also present was Maria Rodriguez, a young widow whose husband Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez had died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan just 18 months earlier. She held their 3-year-old daughter, Sophia, who clutched a small American flag and a teddy bear dressed in military fatigues. "I want Sophia to understand that her daddy was a hero," Maria said quietly. "This ceremony helps make that real for her." James began the modified ceremony with the traditional changing of the guard, his movements precise and deliberate as hundreds of onlookers watched in respectful silence. But when the formal ceremony concluded, instead of continuing with the regular routine, he moved to a designated position where families could approach. Margaret was invited to be the first participant, an honor she initially tried to decline until other families insisted. With trembling hands, she placed a fresh bouquet of yellow roses at the base of the tomb and spoke clearly. "These flowers are for my son, Private First Class Michael Thompson, United States Army, killed in action in Afghanistan. He was 22 years old and believed deeply in the freedom and democracy that America represents." James looked directly at Margaret as she spoke, then turned toward the tomb. In a voice that carried across the silent crowd, he said, "Private First Class Michael Thompson, your service and sacrifice are remembered. Your mother's love honors your memory, and the memory of all who rest in honor here." The moment was electric. Margaret felt the same emotional connection she had experienced the week before, but now it was formalized, recognized, and shared with dozens of other families. She stepped back as Robert and Linda Chun approached with flowers for their son David. One by one, families approached the tomb. Each story was unique, but the themes were universal: love, sacrifice, pride, and an overwhelming need to know that their loved ones' deaths had meaning. James listened to each story with complete attention, responding to each family with the same level of respect and acknowledgement. When Maria Rodriguez approached with her young daughter, the emotional impact intensified. 3-year-old Sophia didn't fully understand what was happening, but she carefully placed her teddy bear next to the flowers and whispered, "This is for Daddy." James knelt down to Sophia's level, breaking protocol once again, but with full approval from his superiors. "Your daddy was very brave," James told the little girl softly. "He protected people like you so you could grow up safe and free. He's watching over you right now, and he's very proud of you." Sophia nodded solemnly and saluted James the way her mother had taught her. The sight of a small child in a military salute while standing at the tomb brought tears to eyes throughout the crowd. Dr. Harper, who was documenting the ceremony, noted the profound transformation in both the participants and the observers. "This wasn't just a memorial service," she would later write. "This was a healing ritual that connected individual grief to collective memory in a way that honored both the specific and the universal nature of military sacrifice." The ceremony continued for 2 hours as each family was given time to honor their loved one. James maintained his composure throughout most of it, but when the final family, an elderly couple whose only son had been killed in Vietnam 50 years earlier, approached the tomb, his emotions nearly overwhelmed him again. "We've waited 50 years for something like this," the elderly father said as he placed a worn photo of his son next to the flowers. "Nobody talks about Vietnam much anymore, but our boy was just as brave and just as dedicated as any soldier who's served since." James's voice was thick with emotion as he acknowledged their son's service. The Vietnam War had ended before he was born, but he understood that grief doesn't follow political timelines. Loss is loss, sacrifice is sacrifice, and honor is eternal regardless of the conflict involved. After the last family had participated, James resumed the traditional changing of the guard ceremony. But something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere around the tomb. The flowers and photos created a colorful display that somehow enhanced rather than detracted from the solemn dignity of the memorial. Colonel Williams observed the entire ceremony from a respectful distance, making notes about what worked well and what could be improved for future family recognition hours. The response from both participants and observers had been overwhelmingly positive, but she was already thinking about logistical challenges as word spread about the new program. "We'll need to limit participation to maintain quality," she explained to her staff after the ceremony. "If this becomes too popular, it could lose the intimate, meaningful nature that made today so special." Margaret lingered after the ceremony to speak with other families. She discovered that many of them had been following her story and had been inspired by her courage to express their own grief publicly. "You gave us permission to honor our children without shame," one mother told her. "You showed us that it's okay to still hurt and still need recognition for their sacrifices." James was approached by several families who wanted to thank him personally for his role in creating this new tradition. Each conversation reinforced his understanding that military service created bonds that transcended individual relationships. These families had become part of his extended military family, and their losses were his losses too. The media coverage of the Family Recognition Hour was extensive but respectful. News organizations from around the world featured the story, but the focus remained on the families and their stories rather than on sensationalism. The ceremony had achieved its goal of creating meaningful connection without exploitation. In the days following the ceremony, Arlington National Cemetery received thousands of requests from other military families wanting to participate in future family recognition hours. Colonel Williams and her staff began developing a reservation system and expanded guidelines to accommodate the demand while maintaining the ceremony's integrity. Margaret prepared to return to Ohio, but she knew her life had permanently changed. She had discovered a community of people who understood her grief and a purpose that extended beyond her own loss. She had also formed a unique bond with James that transcended their brief interaction and had become a symbol of hope for military families everywhere. James continued his duties at the tomb with a deeper understanding of why his service mattered. Every step he took carried the weight of the specific stories he had heard, the individual faces of grief and love he had witnessed. The unknown soldiers he guarded represented not just abstract concepts of sacrifice, but real people like Michael Thompson, David Chun, Carlos Rodriguez, and the Vietnam veteran whose parents had waited 50 years for recognition. The yellow roses that had started everything were now part of a permanent display case that included photos and brief biographies of some of the soldiers honored during the family recognition hours. Visitors from around the world stopped to read these stories and understand the personal cost of military service. As Margaret packed her bags for the trip home to Ohio, she reflected on everything that had happened since that Tuesday morning when she had simply wanted to honor her son's memory. She had never imagined that her moment of grief would create something that brought comfort to so many other families. The impact of the Family Recognition Hour extended far beyond Arlington National Cemetery. Military installations around the world began implementing similar programs, and support organizations for military families reported increased participation as more people felt comfortable expressing their grief publicly. But, perhaps most importantly, the ceremony had achieved something that traditional memorials often failed to accomplish. It had connected the abstract concept of military sacrifice to the very real, very human stories of the families who lived with that sacrifice every day. In doing so, it had honored both the dead and the living in exactly the way Margaret Thompson had hoped when she carried those yellow roses to her son. 6 months after the first Family Recognition Hour, Margaret Thompson returned to Arlington National Cemetery for a very special occasion. The program she had unknowingly started had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with families traveling from all 50 states and several foreign countries to participate in the monthly ceremonies. More importantly, the ripple effects of her simple act of honoring her son had transformed how military families across America processed their grief and found community in their shared experiences. James Mitchell stood at attention as Margaret approached the tomb, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a procession of over 300 military family members, each carrying flowers and photographs. The monthly Family Recognition Hour had evolved into a significant ceremony that required careful coordination and had waiting lists stretching months into the future. The changes went far beyond logistics. Military support organizations reported that families participating in the Arlington ceremonies were experiencing measurably better outcomes in their grief recovery. Dr. Elizabeth Harper's ongoing research documented that the combination of public recognition, shared community, and Symbolic connection to national service helped participants find meaning in their losses rather than remaining trapped in isolated despair. What Margaret and James created wasn't just a ceremony, Dr. Harper explained in her final report. They created a model for how a grateful nation should interact with military families. The recognition is public, the grief is acknowledged, and the sacrifice is connected to ongoing national values. Margaret had become an unofficial spokesperson for military families, speaking at conferences and support group meetings across the country. Her message was always simple and direct. Military families deserved recognition not just for their losses, but for their ongoing service to their communities and their country. When a soldier dies, the family continues serving, she would say. They serve by remembering, by honoring, by ensuring that the sacrifice wasn't in vain. James had been promoted to staff sergeant and given additional responsibilities overseeing the family recognition program at Arlington. His role had expanded beyond ceremonial duties to include training other guards at military installations around the world who wanted to implement similar programs. He traveled regularly to share the protocols and emotional preparation required to handle family interactions with dignity and compassion. The program had also attracted attention from international military organizations. Representatives from Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom had visited Arlington to observe the ceremonies and had implemented their own versions for families of fallen soldiers from various conflicts. The yellow roses that Margaret had carried to honor Michael had become an international symbol of military family recognition. On this particular morning, Margaret carried a special bouquet, not just for Michael, but for all the soldiers whose families had participated in the recognition ceremonies over the past 6 months. The flowers included roses from her own garden in Ohio, but also flowers contributed by families from across the country who wanted to be part of this symbolic gesture. As she approached James at the tomb, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since that first spontaneous moment of grief and recognition. She had found purpose in her pain, community in her isolation, and hope in what had once felt like an ending. "These flowers represent all of our children," she said to James as she placed the elaborate bouquet at the base of the tomb. "They represent the ongoing love of families who refuse to let their sacrifices be forgotten. They represent the connection between those who have fallen and those who continue to serve." James accepted the flowers with the same gravity he had shown 6 months earlier, but now his response was part of a refined ceremony that had been practiced and perfected through repetition. "We receive these flowers in honor of all who have made the ultimate sacrifice," he replied formally. "Their service, their family's sacrifice, and their ongoing legacy of freedom will never be forgotten." But then, James did something unexpected. He stepped closer to Margaret and spoke quietly, just for her. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that not a day has passed since we first met that I haven't thought about Michael and about all the families like yours. You taught me that my duty isn't just to the unknown soldiers. It's to all the mothers and fathers and children who need to know their loved ones' sacrifices still matter." Margaret smiled through tears that had become familiar companions over the past 6 months. "Michael would be so proud of what we've created together," she replied softly. "He would love knowing that his memory helped other families find comfort and recognition." The larger ceremony continued with families from across the country participating in the recognition ritual. Each story was unique, but the common threads remained: love, sacrifice, pride, and the human need for acknowledgement and community in the face of loss. Among the participants was Sofia Rodriguez, now 4 years old, who returned with her mother Maria to honor her father's memory. The little girl had grown more articulate about her father's service and spoke clearly about how Daddy protected people and made sure they were safe. Her presence reminded everyone that military sacrifice affects generations, and that recognition ceremonies needed to acknowledge the ongoing impact on children who would grow up without their military parents. Also participating was a group of high school students from a military academy in Texas who had raised funds to bring 5 Gold Star families to the ceremony. These teenagers understood that military service often began with young people their age making commitments that could cost them everything. Their presence bridged the gap between current service members and families who had already paid the ultimate price. Dr. Harper, who continued documenting the program's impact, noted significant changes in how participants processed their grief over time. "The first ceremony is usually about intense emotion and immediate release," she observed. "But Families who return multiple times report that the ceremony becomes about connection, purpose, and forward-looking service rather than backward-looking grief. James had observed this transformation in countless families over the 6 months since the program began. Parents who arrived devastated and isolated often left with new friendships, renewed purpose, and concrete plans for honoring their children's memories through community service or advocacy work. The program had also inspired changes in how military installations worldwide handled family support. Base commanders reported that implementing recognition ceremonies improved morale among active duty soldiers, who appreciated seeing that their potential sacrifices would be meaningfully honored by their communities. Margaret had used her newfound platform to advocate for improved support services for military families, particularly around grief counseling and long-term community connection. She worked with organizations to develop programs that extended beyond immediate crisis support to address the ongoing challenges of rebuilding life after loss. Grief doesn't end after the funeral, Margaret explained during congressional testimony about military family services. Families need support for years as they figure out how to honor their loved ones' memories while building meaningful lives for themselves. The recognition ceremonies show families that their ongoing service to memory and community is valued and important. As the ceremony concluded, James resumed his traditional duties at the tomb, but the flowers and photographs left by families created a display that enhanced rather than distracted from the memorial's solemnity. Visitors from around the world now expected to see evidence of family participation, and many reported that the personal stories made the larger concepts of military sacrifice more meaningful and immediate. Margaret spent the afternoon visiting with other families, many of whom had become close friends over the months of shared ceremonies. She had discovered that military families formed bonds that transcended geography, politics, and background because they shared experiences that civilians often couldn't fully understand. The yellow roses she had originally brought for Michael had multiplied into hundreds of flowers representing hundreds of stories, but the core message remained the same. Every soldier's sacrifice mattered, every family's grief deserved acknowledgement, and every act of service, by both soldiers and their families, contributed to the larger fabric of national defense and freedom. As the sun set over Arlington National Cemetery, Margaret prepared to return to Ohio once again. But, this time, she was returning with concrete plans for establishing a local chapter of military family support services and a commitment to continue advocating for recognition programs at military installations across the country. James continued his evening duties at the tomb, but his understanding of those duties had been permanently transformed by his encounter with Margaret and the hundreds of families who had followed her example. He was no longer just guarding unknown soldiers. He was maintaining a living memorial that connected past sacrifice to present service and future commitment. The story that began with a simple mother's grief and a guard's compassion had become a nationwide movement that touched thousands of lives. It proved that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the smallest acts of human connection, and that honoring the past can create meaningful pathways toward healing and hope. Margaret Thompson's yellow roses had planted seeds that grew into a garden of recognition, community, and ongoing service that would continue flowering for generations to come. In learning to honor her son's memory, she had taught an entire nation how to better honor all those who sacrificed everything for the freedoms that define American democracy.